usually, when we look back at a major historical event, there's this comforting expectation of a really clean narrative.
Right, with a neat timeline.
Yeah, exactly. You imagine it like a resolved crime scene where the detectives have already done all the heavy lifting. They've swept for prints, tagged all the evidence, and put it all in neat little boxes with clear labels.
And then locked it away in the evidence room.
Exactly. You look at the timeline, and the historian just points at the sequence and says, X happened, so Y happened, cause and effect. It feels really secure.
It's a very human desire, I think. We like things to be settled, categorized, binary, good guys, bad guys.
Planners and victims.
Right. Because it just makes the chaos of the past way more digestible for us.
But then you step into the world of the Russian Revolution, specifically the sweltering, totally chaotic summer of 1917 in the capital city of Petrograd.
Oh, yeah. Chaos is the right word.
And suddenly, you realize you aren't walking into a neat, solved crime scene. You're walking into a landscape where, frankly, half the evidence in those neat little boxes was actually planted by the detectives themselves.
It really is a historical minefield.
It's just a minefield of forgery, state-sponsored perjury, and massive political frame-ups.
It's the absolute definition of a rigged historical record. And, I mean, the distortions we're going to look at today aren't just accidental misinterpretations.
Right?
Or, like, sloppy translations.
No, not at all.
We are dealing with deliberate, weaponized fake news that was engineered in real time. And it quite literally changed the trajectory of the 20th century.
And that jarring disconnect between the textbook narrative we've all kind of passively absorbed and the startling reality of what the archives actually say, that's exactly what we are unpacking today.
I'm really looking forward to this one.
Me too. We are taking an intensive, really forensic look at a highly specific, fascinating stack of sources to dissect what might be the greatest political slander of the modern era. So, I want to welcome you to today's deep dive. If you're listening, you are joining us to unravel this incredible web.
It's quite a web.
It really is. Now, our core foundation today comes from chapters 22 through 25 of Leon Trotsky's monumental history of the Russian Revolution. But, we aren't stopping with just a first-hand account.
Right, because memory is fallible. And history demands cross-referencing.
Exactly. So to complement and verify that account, we're bringing in the heavy artillery of modern archival research.
The good stuff.
We'll be examining the groundbreaking discoveries of historian Alexander Rabinovich, who actually got into the Soviet vaults in the 1990s.
Which is a massive deal.
Huge. And we're also going to look at the rigorous financial forensics of Semyon Leandris, who literally tracked the paper trail of the Russian Revolution.
The literal receipts.
The receipts. And finally, we're going to cap it all off by looking at contemporary historiographical critiques from the World Socialist website, specifically regarding how modern best-selling historians, guys like Sean McMeekin and Robert Service, are handling, or maybe mishandling, this newly uncovered evidence.
It's a massive stack of material. But before we drop into the streets of Petrograd, I know we need to set the parameters for this conversation.
Yes, please do. The ground rules are important here.
Right. So let's establish this early on. If you are joining us for this deep dive, keep in mind that the sources we are unpacking contain highly politically charged material.
Very charged.
We are dealing with Marxist revolution, the Bolshevik Party, the Mensheviks, and their modern capitalist or anti-communist critics. My role here and our role together is entirely impartial.
100%.
We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints. We are not taking sides, nor are we validating the political ideologies of the original source material, whether they originate from the far left or the conservative right.
We're just looking at the facts.
Exactly. Our sole job is to analyze the factual arguments, scrutinize the archival evidence, and really just understand the historical narratives contained within these texts. This is an exercise in historiography. We're looking at how history is written, how it gets weaponized by those in power, and eventually how forensic research can dismantle a century-old lie.
Beautifully said. Okay, so to understand the massive state-sponsored slander that eventually chased Vladimir Lenin into hiding in the summer of 1917, we first have to understand the incredibly explosive reality on the ground that triggered it.
The context is everything.
Right. We have to rewind to a period known as the July days, July 3rd through 5th, 1917. So set the scene for us. What does Petrograd look, feel, and smell like in July 1917.
You have to picture a capital city that is at an absolute boiling point. I mean, both literally and politically. It's summer, it's sweltering, and the February Revolution had overthrown the Tsar just a few months earlier.
The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 3 centuries, was just gone.
Gone. But the regime that replaced it, the provisional government, was already choking on its own internal contradictions.
Let's define the provisional government quickly, just because it gets confusing for people. Who exactly are these people?
So the provisional government was essentially an unelected coalition made up mostly of liberal elites, industrialists, and former nobles.
Like factory owners and bankers.
Exactly. The party of the liberal bourgeoisie was called the Cadets, and they basically stepped into the power vacuum after the Tsar fell. But here's the issue. The masses in the streets, the workers in these massive factories, the soldiers freezing out the trenches, they'd overthrown the Tsar because they wanted 3 very simple things.
Peace, land, and bread.
Peace, land, and bread. They wanted an immediate end to World War I. They wanted the huge aristocratic estates broken up and given to the peasants, and they wanted the crippling food rationing to stop.
But the provisional government can't deliver on any of that, can they?
Well, they won't deliver on it. They are tied financially and politically to the Allied powers, Britain and France, so they absolutely refuse to end the war.
Right, they have treaty obligations.
And they were tied to the landlord, so they refused to distribute the land. Plus, the economy is collapsing, so the bread lines in Petrograd are just getting longer and angrier by the day.
And it wasn't just that they weren't ending the war. The provisional government had just launched a massive, disastrous new military offensive in June.
Which was a total bloodbath, just a strategic nightmare.
And the news of that military disaster is slowly filtering back to the capital by early July. So you have hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, and particularly the 1st Machine Gun Regiment stationed in Petrograd, who are absolutely furious.
Beyond furious. They realize they have essentially swapped a czar for a government of bankers and factory owners who are still sending them to die in the trenches.
Let's talk about the 1st Machine Gun Regiment because they are a crucial player here.
They really are the spark. They were a massive garrison, heavily armed, obviously, and they had just received orders from the provisional government to ship out to the front lines to participate in this doomed June offensive.
And they basically look at these orders and say, absolutely not.
Right. They say, no, we aren't going to die for a government we don't believe in. They decide right then and there that it is time to overthrow the provisional government.
And this brings us to a really critical detail from Trotsky's account and the archival sources. This eruption in July, it was a completely spontaneous, organic, armed rebellion.
Yes.
This was not like a carefully orchestrated, top-down coup engineered by a secret cabal in a smoke-filled room.
That is such a vital distinction to make. It goes against almost every Hollywood depiction of a revolution you've ever seen. The masses literally flooded the streets on July 3rd, and they were armed to the teeth with rifles. They had machine guns mounted on armored cars.
Just a total organic uprising. Hundreds of thousands of people marching out of the factory districts.
But here's the bizarre twist, right? They weren't marching to seize power for themselves.
No, they weren't. They were marching to the Tauride Palace, which was the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet, demanding that the Soviet take total power from the provisional government.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of the Soviet, because modern ears hear that word and immediately think of, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the KGB, the whole monolithic state.
Right, a giant bureaucracy.
But in 1917, the word Soviet meant something very different, right?
Yeah, the word Soviet simply means council in Russian. That's it. In 1917, these were hyper-democratic grassroots assemblies. Every factory, every military battalion, every working-class neighborhood elected their own delegates to the Petrograd Soviet.
So it was essentially a parliament of the lower classes.
Exactly. It was a direct representation of the workers and soldiers.
And who actually controlled this parliament in July 1917? At that specific moment, it was controlled by moderate socialists, specifically the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries. Our sources refer to them frequently as the compromisers.
Why compromiser? What were they compromising on?
Because they firmly believed that Russia just wasn't ready for a socialist revolution. They believed in this very rigid two-stage theory of history. They thought, okay, we got rid of the Tsar, so now we must have a long period of capitalist bourgeois democracy before we can even think about moving towards socialism.
I see.
Therefore, even though the Soviet had the absolute loyalty of all the troops and all the workers, meaning they had the actual physical power in the city, These moderate leaders insisted on propping up the deeply unpopular provisional government.
This creates a situation that historians call dual power, right?
Precisely. The provisional government had the formal legal authority on paper, but no actual power on the streets. If they gave an order, the soldiers would literally check with the Soviet first to see if they should actually obey it.
That's wild.
It is. And the Soviet, on the other hand, had all the actual power on the streets, but absolutely refused to take formal authority.
It's an incredibly unstable way to run a country. I was thinking about it. And it's like a massive crowd trying to force a steering wheel into the hands of a terrified passenger who is screaming that they don't have a license and absolutely refuses to drive.
That's exactly what it felt like.
The workers and soldiers are marching, waving guns, trying to force their own moderate elected leaders to take the reins of government. The main chant in the streets was, "All power to the Soviets."
And those moderate leaders are flat out refusing. They are barricaded inside the palace, completely horrified by their own supporters.
They would literally rather call in loyalist Cossack cavalry troops from the front to shoot their own workers than take power.
It is a stunning historical paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The masses are trying to launch a revolution to force someone else into power.
There is this incredibly vivid, almost cinematic anecdote from Trotsky's text that perfectly captures this whole absurdity. It's the afternoon of July 4th. There is this massive, angry crowd outside the Tauride Palace.
Just a sea of people.
Tens of thousands of armed sailors from the Kronstadt Naval Base, factory workers, soldiers. The tension is just unbearable, and Viktor Chernov, who is one of the leading moderate ministers of the Soviet, comes out to try and calm the crowd down.
Right, he tries to give this pacifying speech, basically telling them to go home, trust the process, we've got it under control.
And the crowd is just not having it. They start searching him for weapons, and out of the sea of angry faces, a nameless, exhausted, fuelless worker pushes his way to the very front. He's covered in the grime of the factory. He shakes this calloused, horny fist right in Chernov's face and screams, "Take the power when they give it to you, you son of a bitch."
It's probably one of the most famous quotes of the entire revolution, because it perfectly distills that political deadlock. The workers are handing them the country on a silver platter, and the moderates are desperately swatting it away.
And Chernov is physically detained by the crowd right after that. They throw him in the back of an open car and hold him hostage.
Things escalated so quickly.
It gets so volatile that Leon Trotsky himself, who was highly respected by the Kronstadt sailors, has to physically wade into this furious armed mob. He climbs into the car, gives a speech praising the sailors to sort of distract them, and personally escorts Chernov back into the palace to de-escalate the situation.
If he hadn't done that, they very well might have torn Chernov apart.
The irony is just rich. The masses didn't want to overthrow the Soviet. They wanted the Soviet to act like a sovereign power.
But the moderate compromisers viewed this demand not as a democratic mandate from their own base, but as a violent insurrection against a legitimate democratic order of the provisional government.
Which naturally brings us to the Bolsheviks. Because the spontaneous, messy, organic, completely chaotic nature of the July days entirely contradicts the popular historical image of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party.
It really does. It shatters it completely.
Right. If you grew up in the West during the Cold War, or honestly, even if you grew up in the Soviet Union under Stalin, you were taught a very specific, almost mythological narrative about the Bolshevik Party of 1917.
The myth of the monolith. For decades, the historiography on both sides of the Iron Curtain was remarkably aligned on this one specific point.
Which is strange to think about.
Very strange. Both Soviet Stalinist historians and Western bourgeois historians peddled the exact same narrative, that the Bolshevik Party was a highly centralized, strictly disciplined, monolithic vanguard organization.
Why did both sides want to push that specific narrative?
Well, for completely opposite reasons, but they arrived at the same destination. Stalin and the later Soviet bureaucracy needed to project an image of perfect, unbroken historical continuity.
Right, they needed legitimacy.
Exactly. They wanted to claim that Lenin was an infallible, godlike figure who ruled the party from the top down, giving orders that were instantly obeyed without question. This justified Stalin's own dictatorial top-down control later on. He essentially said, look, this is how the party has always operated.
And the West. What was their angle?
Western historians during the Cold War embraced the exact same premise, but they used it as an indictment. They argued that the Bolsheviks were an authoritarian cult of personality from the very beginning. The narrative was that Lenin orchestrated everything like a master puppeteer, executed a flawless military coup, and forced his will onto a passive Russian population.
But if we actually look at our sources, specifically Trotsky's account of the July days, that narrative hits a massive brick
A
wall.
huge one.
If the party was supposedly this monolithic machine controlled by Lenin pressing buttons at a control desk, how on earth do we explain the July days catching the Bolshevik leadership so completely, utterly off guard? The texts are very clear. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party did not want this uprising.
They absolutely did not. And that exact contradiction is what drove historian Alexander Rabinowitz to dedicate decades of his life to this topic.
Right.
Rabinowitz's work is really a centerpiece of our deep dive today because his trajectory as a historian is just fascinating.
Right, he wasn't exactly a Marxist sympathizer going in, was he?
Far from it. Rabinowitz grew up in the United States in a very anti-communist emigre community. He was heavily influenced by Menshevik exiles who had fled Russia and harbored a deep, abiding hatred for the Bolsheviks.
So he had a very specific bias.
Oh, totally. He began his academic career fully expecting to write a comprehensive history, proving the standard Western narrative, that the Bolsheviks were a dictatorial cult that executed a manipulative top-down coup.
So what changed his mind?
1991 happened. The Soviet Union collapsed.
And suddenly, the vault doors swing open.
Exactly. For the first time in history, Western historians were granted unprecedented access to Soviet and KGB archives. Documents that had been locked away or classified for 70 years were suddenly just sitting on reading room tables in Moscow.
That must have been incredible for a historian.
A gold mine. Rabinowitz went straight into those archives. He didn't just read the official published memoirs. He looked at the internal minutes of the Bolshevik Petersburg Committee, the district-level meeting notes, the scribbled debates of local organizers, the personal files.
And what he discovers completely shatters the monolith myth.
It pulverized it. Rabinowitz found that the Bolshevik Party of 1917 wasn't a monolith at all. It was deeply decentralized, highly argumentative, heavily localized, and surprisingly democratic. They were constantly fighting amongst themselves over strategy, timing, and theory.
Can we look at how that internal friction played out specifically during the July days? Because the divide in the party at that exact moment is just incredible.
Let's look at the printing presses. Rabinowitz proved this internal schism by looking at the party's own newspapers in the weeks leading up to the July uprising. You had the official paper of the Central Committee, Pravda, which was being overseen by Lenin.
Okay.
And then you had a completely different paper run by the Bolshevik military organization called Soldatskaya Pravda, the Soldier's Truce.
The military organization being the wing of the party embedded directly inside the volatile, angry garrisons like the machine gun regiment.
Exactly. And if you read those two papers side by side in late June and early July 1917, you would see a massive, glaring contradiction. The military organization's paper was actively encouraging an armed uprising.
Wow.
They were printing incredibly radical demands, reflecting the boiling anger of the troops who didn't want to be sent to the front.
Meanwhile, what is Lenin printing in Pravda?
Lenin and the Central Committee are printing articles urging extreme caution. They are practically begging the soldiers not to revolt yet. They're dispatching agitators to the factories, pleading with the workers to stay at their benches.
So the grassroots military wing of the party is literally defying the Central Committee in print and dragging the leadership into the streets. That is the exact opposite of a top-down monolith. The party leadership is desperately trying to hold back its own radicalized base.
It's a complete inversion of the myth.
Which brings us to a huge strategic question. If Lenin and the Central Committee realized the uprising was a bad idea, and if they spent July 3rd actively trying to stop it, why did they ultimately step to the front of the marching columns on July 4th?
Right, why take ownership of a massive insurrection you actively tried to prevent?
Exactly.
To understand that pivot, we have to understand the historical trauma that haunted every socialist leader in 1917. I have to talk about 1871.
The Paris Commune.
Yes. Without understanding the ghost of the Paris Commune, the Bolshevik strategy in July makes zero sense.
Let's break that down for someone who might not be familiar with 19th century French history. What exactly happened in 1871, and why was Lenin so terrified of repeating it?
So in 1871, following the Franco-Prussian War, the working class of Paris rose up and established a radical, democratic, socialist government known as the Paris Commune. They took over the city. It was a massive historical milestone for the Marxist movement.
But there was a fatal flaw, wasn't there?
A huge one. They're isolated. The rest of France, the conservative rural provinces, did not support them. The conservative French national government simply retreated to Versailles, surrounded the city of Paris, slowly gathered their military strength, and then invaded their own capital.
And they slaughtered them.
It was an absolute massacre. During the Bloody Week of May 1871, the French army summarily executed tens of thousands of workers, men, women, and children, in the streets of Paris. It was a generational trauma for the international socialist movement.
Just a horrific lesson.
The ultimate lesson in what happens when a revolutionary vanguard moves too fast and gets isolated from the rest of the country.
And Trotsky's analysis points out that the Bolshevik leadership in early July 1917 looked at Petrograd and saw the exact same setup.
Exactly the same.
Petrograd was a pressure cooker, boiling over and ready to revolt. But Petrograd was just one city. The vast, sprawling Russian provinces, the tens of millions of peasants in the countryside, and the millions of soldiers out in the frontline trenches, they were not there yet.
Those groups still harbored some illusions in the provisional government, or at least in the moderate compromisers. They just hadn't gone through the intense political schooling that the Petrograd workers had over the last few months.
So they were on totally different timelines.
Exactly. If the Petrograd workers and the machine gun regiment seized power alone in July, the provisional government wouldn't even have to fight them immediately.
What would they do?
They would just pull loyal conservative troops from the front, frame the Petrograd workers as German saboteurs who were betraying the war effort, blockade the capital, starve it out, and then march in and crush the radicalized workers and soldiers.
It would have been the tragedy of the Paris Commune repeating itself in the snows of Russia. The entire revolutionary vanguard would be decapitated in 1 week.
Which is exactly why the Bolsheviks tried to stop the July demonstration. But once it became clear that the masses were going to march, regardless, once hundreds of thousands of people were already in the streets with rifles, the Central Committee faced an agonizing choice.
Right.
Do they wash their hands of it, stand on the sidelines and say, "We told you so," while the workers get slaughtered? Or do they jump into the chaos?
It's like being the designated driver at a party that has completely spun out of control.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You didn't want to leave the house yet. You spent all night telling everyone it was a terrible idea to leave. But now everyone is piling into the car anyway. They are drunk and someone is stepping on the gas.
Right. The car is moving whether you like it or not.
Exactly. If you just stand on the driveway with your arms crossed to prove a point, they're going to drive off a cliff and die. So what do? You jump into the driver's seat, grab the wheel, and take the keys. You don't do it because you want to drive. You do it to hit the brakes.
Yes.
You take control just to ensure everyone gets home with a few bruises instead of dying in a fiery crash.
That is a phenomenal analogy for the concept of a tactical retreat. On the night of July 3rd, the Bolshevik Central Committee made the agonizing decision to officially endorse the demonstration. They placed themselves at the head of the movement specifically to constrain it.
They turned what could have been a chaotic, fragmented, armed insurrection into a massive, centralized, but fundamentally peaceful political demonstration.
And because they took leadership, they retained the moral and political authority to eventually call it off. On July 4th, you had this awe-inspiring display of power, hundreds of thousands of people. The sources mention 80,000 workers from the massive Putilov metal works alone, marching with their wives and children, demanding the Soviet take power.
Just a staggering number of people.
But once the demonstration peaked, and it was clear the Soviet leaders were still refusing to take power, the Bolshevik agitators spread through the crowd. They urged everyone to declare victory, pack up, and go back to their barracks and factories in an orderly fashion.
And it worked. The sources note that the casualties from sporadic street fighting were counted in the tens, not the tens of thousands that a Paris Commune scenario would have yielded.
By stepping in, the Bolsheviks absorbed a massive, immediate political blow, but they prevented the physical annihilation of the Petrograd working class.
They saved them.
They preserved the vital cadres, the experienced organizers, and the militant soldiers who would eventually go on to lead the successful October Revolution just a few months later.
They survived. But in doing so, by openly associating themselves with the uprising, they painted a massive neon target on their own backs.
A huge target.
Which brings us to the backlash. Because the provisional government didn't just breathe a sigh of relief and thank the Bolsheviks for de-escalating the situation, they saw an opening. They used this opportunity to try and wipe the Bolshevik party off the political map entirely.
The provisional government had been absolutely terrified by the July days. They were barricaded in their offices, realizing how incredibly close they came to losing everything.
They were shaking in their boots.
Literally.
Hmm.
The moderate Soviet leaders and the government ministers, figures like Alexander Kerensky, who would soon become prime minister, and the minister of justice, Pavel Pereverzev, they were desperate.
So what was their move?
Well, the immediate danger was over, but they knew the Bolsheviks were still out there, and they still had the support of the factories. The government needed a way to instantly, decisively turn the rest of the country, specifically those neutral frontline troops who hadn't joined the uprising against the Bolsheviks.
And what is the fastest, most effective way to turn an army against a political faction while you are in the middle of a brutal world war?
You accuse them of high treason.
Exactly, you call them spies. This is the birth of the infamous German gold slander. The government suddenly releases a bombshell cache of evidence to the press, claiming that Vladimir Lenin was not a revolutionary at all.
Right.
He was a paid, covert agent of the German general staff, specifically sent back to Russia to incite the July uprising on behalf of the Kaiser, using vast sums of German money laundered through banks in Stockholm.
It was the ultimate political frame-up. Let's look at this evidence the Ministry of Justice rolled out, because the sources, both Trotsky's contemporaneous account and modern archival research, just tear it to shreds.
So where did this claim actually originate?
It came from highly dubious sources within the old Russian military intelligence apparatus. We're talking about officers who were deeply loyal to the deposed Tsar and absolutely hated the socialists.
Right, they tried out this star witness, a guy named Corporal Yermolenko.
Yes, Yermolenko. He was a purported prisoner of war who claimed he had been captured by the Germans. His story was that German intelligence recruited him to go back to Russia as a saboteur, and during his briefing, the German officers just casually mentioned him, a lowly corporal. Oh, by the way, Vladimir Lenin is also working for us, just so you know.
It's laughable on its face. The German high command is sharing top-secret espionage lists with a random corporal.
It makes no sense.
And he wasn't the only witness, right? There was another guy.
Yes, a merchant named Z. Burstein, who provided documents about a purported commercial front in Stockholm. But even the government's own handlers and intelligence officers considered Burstein to be a wholly untrustworthy opportunist and a blackmailer.
So you have a fantasist corporal and a shady merchant forming the bedrock of this accusation. And if we look at this just on a logical, political level, the sheer absurdity of the claim is staggering.
It really is.
Think about who Vladimir Lenin is. This is a man who has dedicated his entire adult life to the uncompromising international Marxist revolution. His own brother was hanged by the Tsar. He has lived for decades in poverty and exile, writing endlessly about the need to overthrow the capitalist class globally.
Right.
And we are supposed to believe that he is secretly doing the bidding of the right-wing, aristocratic, monarchist German Kaiser.
It was politically nonsensical. Lenin's entire program, the core of Bolshevism, was about sparking an international revolution that would overthrow all the warring governments, which very much included the German ruling class.
Exactly.
But as Trotsky points out in his history, in a moment of extreme panic and counter-revolutionary backlash, logic simply does not matter. The Slander wasn't designed to win a debate in the university seminar. It was designed to play on the deepest, most visceral prejudices, war weariness, and fears of the general public.
And it worked beautifully. The physical and political fallout was immediate, and it was brutal. The provisional government unleashed a wave of terror. The printing presses of the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, were physically smashed to pieces by right-wing mobs and military cadets.
Total destruction.
The offices were raided. Leon Trotsky was arrested and thrown into the Krusty prison.
And Lenin.
Lenin becomes the most wanted man in Russia. He is forced to completely change his appearance. He shaves off his iconic goatee and mustache, puts on a wig, gets fake identification papers, and has to flee across the border to Finland in the dead of night.
It's like something out of a thriller.
Truly. There are stories of him hiding in a hayloft in a rural village called Razliv, just to avoid being lynched by right-wing death squads who were roaming the streets looking for him.
Trotsky refers to this specific period in the summer of 1917 as the month of the Great Slander. What is truly fascinating from a historiographical perspective is how effectively this fake news united all of the Bolsheviks' disparate enemies.
It really brought them together.
Suddenly, you had the cadets, the liberal factory owners, the compromised socialists and the Soviets, the conservative generals, and the old Tsarist intelligence officers, all singing from the exact same hymn sheet.
A united front of slander.
It created an unprecedented, month-long avalanche of media distortion. Every single newspaper in the capital, except the underground socialist press, was screaming in bold headlines that the Bolsheviks were German spies.
The sources mention that this propaganda was so overwhelming that even some of the militant soldiers and sailors who had marched alongside the Bolsheviks just days earlier were confused.
They didn't know what to believe.
They were neutralized by this lie. The fake news completely paralyzed the working-class movement in Petrograd for weeks.
It did. It broke the momentum of the revolution entirely. But here is where the study of history becomes critical. Because for decades after 1917, many mainstream historians in the West accepted the premise that there must have been some fire beneath all that smoke. They thought, okay, maybe Lenin wasn't literally taking daily orders from the Kaiser like a James Bond villain, but surely the Bolsheviks were secretly funded by German gold to destabilize Russia, right?
Which brings up a fair point. If I'm listening to this, I might say, but hang on, the provisional government claimed they had intercepted telegrams proving these money transfers. They literally published intercepted coded messages moving between a trading firm in Stockholm and Bolshevik sympathizers in Petrograd. That sounds like pretty solid, tangible evidence of illicit foreign funding.
It absolutely sounds like a smoking gun. Until, of course, you apply rigorous forensic history and financial accounting to those specific telegrams. And that brings us to the incredible work of historian Simeon Leandris.
Yes, Leandris.
In 1995, Leandris published what can only be described as a masterful monograph titled The Bolsheviks' German Gold Revisited.
So walk us through what Leandris actually did. What made his 1995 study so different from all the anti-communist historians who came before him?
Previous historians, especially conservative scholars and anti-Bolshevik emigres writing during the Cold War, had built their cases on a very cherry-picked selection of evidence. They only looked at 29 specific telegrams out of a much larger batch that had been intercepted by French and Russian intelligence.
Why only 29? Why ignore the rest?
Because those 29 were cryptic and easy to manipulate. You have to remember how telegrams worked in 1917. The original messages were often written in Russian, then transliterated into Latin script by telegraph operators who didn't necessarily speak the language.
So there are already errors.
Tons of errors. They're sent across borders and then translated into French by intelligence officers. They were brief, they lacked context, and if you squinted hard enough and assumed bad faith, you could interpret them as coded espionage chatter.
But Leandris wasn't satisfied with the cherry-picked 29.
No, he wanted the whole picture. He was the first modern historian to gain access to and painstakingly examine the complete, unredacted set of all 66 intercepted French telegrams that the provisional government had used to build their initial case.
Okay, so he gets his hands on the full data set. He looks at all 66 telegrams. He digs into the actual financial ledgers. What does he find?
He unpacks the core financial reality of this situation. And his first finding is a partial confirmation. Yes, there was absolutely money and correspondence moving between Petrograd and a trading firm in Stockholm run by socialists. There was a financial network.
So the government was right. There was a money trail.
Here is the twist. Leandris trapped the money. And he found that it was moving in the wrong direction.
Wait, explain the mechanics of that. How does money moving in the wrong direction exonerate them?
The provisional government's entire slander was built on the claim that German money was flowing from this trading firm in Stockholm into Petrograd to fund Lenin's newspapers and arm the Bolsheviks.
Right.
But Leandris looked at the actual banking records and the full context of the 66 telegrams. The telegrams primarily detailed payments from a woman named Evgenia Sumonson. She was a relative of a prominent Bolshevik, and she was based in Petrograd. The telegrams show her sending money to the trading firm in Stockholm.
Wait, so the rubles were leaving Russia?
Exactly. Goods, specifically things like pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, and literal pencils, which were in incredibly high demand during the war, were being shipped from Sweden to Russia. Evgenia Sumonson was selling them in Petrograd, taking the rubles, and wiring the money back to Sweden to pay for the goods.
Wow.
It wasn't an espionage ring. It was a completely legitimate, albeit mundane, import-export business being run by people who happened to have socialist sympathies.
So all of this covert espionage communication that the provisional government hyped up as a massive conspiracy was literally just a businesswoman wiring money to pay for imported pencils and medicine.
Yes. Leandris states unequivocally in his book that not a single ruble flowed from that Stockholm firm into Bolshevik coffers. The money flowed out of Russia to pay for commercial goods.
That is wild.
Furthermore, by analyzing the full text of all 66 telegrams, Leandris proved that the messages weren't even coded. The strange phrasing that earlier historians thought was a secret cipher was just Standard, abbreviated commercial telegraph language, compounded by bad translations.
That is a staggering revelation. But here is the most damning part of Landris's conclusion, as noted in our sources. The provisional government didn't just make an honest mistake.
No, they didn't. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Leandris proved that behind closed doors, the provisional government's own internal investigators quietly examined all the foreign monetary transactions of the Bolsheviks. And they concluded, privately, that there was zero evidence of a German connection.
They knew the telegrams were just pencil imports.
But the Ministry of Justice pushed the fake news to the press anyway because it was a politically convenient way to destroy their rivals.
It was a conscious, intentional frame-up by the state.
So, if we take stock of where we are, by the mid-1990s, the vault doors of the archives are open. Alexander Rabinovich has definitively debunked the myth of the Bolshevik monolith, proving they were a decentralized, grassroots democratic party.
Yes.
Semyon Leandris has used rigorous, undeniable financial forensics to prove that the German gold narrative was a total hoax.
A total fabrication.
You would think, logically, that this historiographical debate is finally settled. The evidence is clear, the crime scene is processed, and the innocent verdict is in.
One would certainly hope. But history, and specifically the writing of history, doesn't operate in a political vacuum.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing section of our deep dive. If the archives opened up and these myths were rigorously, factually destroyed by scholars in the 90s, why on earth are we still seeing these exact same lies printed in modern, best-selling, critically acclaimed history books today?
This is where we turn to the contemporary critiques provided in our sources by the World Socialist website. They focus on a cadre of modern, highly credentialed historians who are leading what can really only be described as a revival of historical falsification.
Let's talk specifically about Sean McMeekin. He is a prominent historian. He publishes a major book in 2017 called The Russian Revolution, A New History. He also writes a highly visible op-ed for the New York Times titled, Was Lenin a German Agent?
Right.
And the sources we are looking at detail some genuinely shocking academic malpractice by McMeekin regarding this exact issue of the German gold.
What is fascinating here is the sheer brazenness of the distortion. McMeekin clearly wants to revive the German gold slander. His overarching thesis is that Lenin was essentially a hostile foreign agent who executed a hostile takeover of Russia.
But as a historian, McMeekin has a glaring problem.
A huge problem. Semyon Leandris's 1995 book exists, it is peer-reviewed, and it definitively proved the opposite using the primary source telegrams.
So, if you are McMeekin, and the defining forensic study of the decade disproves your thesis, what do? Do you challenge his math? Do you find new telegrams?
No. You deliberately twist the words of your own source material. In his 2017 book, McMeekin writes a sentence claiming that the telegraphic evidence of German gold flowing to the Bolsheviks must remain obscure. He is telling the reader, we just don't know for sure, it's a murky mystery.
Okay.
And to support that claim of obscurity, in his footnotes, he cites Semyon Leandris's 1995 book.
Wait, I just want to make sure I'm grasping the audacity of this. He cites the specific historian who unequivocally solved the mystery to claim to his readers that the mystery is unsolved.
Exactly. He inverted the conclusion of his own primary source. If you actually go and read Leandris's book, Leandris says that the evidence was obscure to past historians who only had the 29 cherry-picked telegrams, but that his own 1995 study of all 66 telegrams definitively cleared it up and proved the Bolsheviks innocent. McMeekin takes that quote completely out of context. He uses Leandris's acknowledgement of past obscurity to tell modern readers that the evidence is still murky today, thereby leaving the door wide open for his revival of a 100-year-old right-wing slander.
That is just, wow. To use a source that explicitly debunks your thesis as proof of your thesis is incredibly bold. It assumes your readers are never going to check the footnotes.
It relies on it.
And McMeekin isn't an isolated case, is he? The sources point to a broader trend in academia.
They do. The critiques also heavily focus on Robert Service, who is a very prominent, widely respected historian at Oxford University. Service wrote a major biography of Stalin, and the WSWS critique points out severe methodological flaws that serve a similar political purpose.
What does Service do in his biography that's so problematic?
The critique argues that Service essentially ignores the vast, bloody ideological war that took place between Trotsky's left opposition and Stalin's growing bureaucracy in the 1920s.
To give some context for that, Stalin didn't just inherit the Bolshevik Party.
No, he physically exterminated its original leadership. He murdered Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and thousands of old Bolsheviks who had actually led the revolution.
But Service smooths over these rivers of blood.
He does. He claims that Stalin was a legitimate, faithful Marxist intellectual and that his brutal totalitarianism was the natural, inevitable outcome of Lenin's thought.
There is also a very specific detail in the critique about Service's handling of Stalin's anti-Semitism.
Yes, the WSWS notes that Service bizarrely downplays or attempts to excuse Stalin's well-documented anti-Semitism.
Why would a Western anti-communist historian want to defend Joseph Stalin against charges of anti-Semitism? That seems entirely counterintuitive.
It does, until you look at the ideological architecture they are trying to build. If you admit that Stalin was a virulent anti-Semite who systematically murdered the original internationalist leaders of the revolution, many of whom, like Trotsky, were of Jewish descent, then you have to admit that Stalinism was a fundamental break from Bolshevism.
Ah, I see where this is going.
You have to admit it was a counter-revolutionary betrayal of the 1917 project, not its logical continuation.
And if Stalinism is a betrayal of the revolution, then the original revolution might have been a genuine democratic movement. And they can't have that.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? Why are these highly credentialed, best-selling historians at elite institutions risking their academic reputations to peddle century-old lies, twist archival data, and misquote their own footnotes? What is the ultimate point of this?
If we connect all these threads to the bigger picture, the sources argue that this isn't just sloppy research or accidental bias. It is a conscious, deeply embedded ideological project.
How so?
Think about the implications of Alexander Rabinowicz's archival findings. If the Russian Revolution was actually a genuine, massive democratic movement of workers and soldiers who organically demanded a change to society, then socialism is a legitimate historical expression of working-class interests.
Right. It means regular people can successfully organize to overthrow a capitalist system that is sending them to die in wars.
Exactly. It makes revolution look possible and, more importantly, popular.
Yes, exactly.
But if you can delegitimize the revolution, if you can portray it as nothing more than a hostile, undemocratic takeover by a tiny cult of foreign agents funded by German gold, which is what McMeekin tries to do, or if you can argue that Stalin's murderous dictatorship was the only possible outcome of Marxist thought, as Service tries to do, then you achieve something much larger.
You criminalize the very idea of socialist revolution.
You criminalize it completely.
You make the idea of fundamentally changing the economic system look not just dangerous, but inherently fraudulent. You are telling people that anyone who wants systemic change is either a foreign spy or a future dictator.
Precisely. By falsifying the history of 1917, these modern historians attempt to legitimize modern capitalist imperialism and the current status quo. They are essentially telling the public, don't look at the massive inequalities or the contradictions of your own society, because history proves that any attempt to change it organically is just a foreign plot or a guaranteed path to tyranny.
It is the exact same political function that the German gold slander served for the provisional government back in 1917.
Yes. It neutralizes the opposition by framing them as completely illegitimate.
It is history as a weapon.
Very much so.
Okay, let's step back and summarize this incredible, twisted journey we've just been on. We started in the sweltering, chaotic streets of Petrograd during the July days. We saw an organic, furious, completely spontaneous uprising where the workers and the machine gun regiment tried to force power into the hands of a terrified, moderate Soviet leadership who flatly refused to take it.
We saw the Bolsheviks, terrified of repeating the massacre of the Paris Commune, reluctantly take the leadership of an uprising they opposed. They stepped to the front specifically to hit the brakes and save the Petrograd workers from slaughter.
Which they did. They preserved the working class. But in return, the panicking provisional government invented the German gold slander out of thin air. They used fake testimony from a corporal and deliberately misconstrued commercial telegrams about pencils to frame Lenin as a spy, smashing the radical left and forcing the leadership underground.
Then we saw how the opening of the Soviet archives in the 1990s allowed historians like Alexander Rabinowicz to completely dismantle the myth of the Bolshevik monolith, proving they were a dynamic, argumentative grassroots party.
And we saw Semyon Leandris use rigorous financial forensics to prove the German gold narrative was a total, documented hoax.
Only to end up in the modern day watching prominent historians deliberately twist those exact same archival findings to muddy the waters all over again, serving a modern political agenda to delegitimize the concept of revolution.
And as we wrap up, I want to reiterate the framework we established at the beginning.
Yes, it's important to remember.
Our exploration today was a deep dive into historiographical analysis. We looked at how historical narratives are constructed in the streets, how they are weaponized by the state in moments of crisis, how they are eventually debunked by forensic research, and how they can be resurrected by modern academia.
We did this by examining the factual record, without endorsing the political ideologies of the historical actors involved. The goal is to understand the mechanics of history, how truth is contested, and why the past is never truly settled.
Absolutely. The crime scene is never fully closed. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with as you go about your day. Think about the sheer terrifying speed at which the German gold fake news paralyzed Petrograd in the summer of 1917.
It happens so fast.
It literally drove the leaders of a massive revolution underground overnight, and it achieved that incredible level of disruption relying entirely on printed newspapers, word of mouth, and a few corrupt officials whispering to journalists.
Right, very rudimentary tech.
Now look at the world today. Ask yourself, if a modern establishment feels its grip on power slipping, how much faster and how much more devastating could a fabricated historical narrative or a political slander become? Especially when it's no longer relying on printing presses, but is supercharged by modern algorithms, social media echo chambers, and AI-generated deepfakes.
It's a sobering thought.
If the evidence can be planted in our neat little historical boxes that easily a century ago, are we any better equipped to spot the forgery today? Or when the next crisis hits, are we going to be just as vulnerable to the slander as those exhausted soldiers in the July days? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, question the narrative, and always, always double-check the footnotes.